This year's games took place in an arena known as Sweet Village. As the tributes were lifted into the arena, they gasped at the mere sight of this peculiar arena. As Priscilla announced it was called the Sweet Village, Rubius joked that he wanted to get some popcorn for these games. The cornucopia lay in the middle of a pink field surrounded by trees representing a type of candy that had once been called lollies. Rocks representing small candies were scattered throughout the arena, with a chocolate river running through the arena. Several gingerbread houses, which game maker friends stated had been inspired by an old Germanian tale called Hansel and Gretel, were scattered around the arena in no particular order. Several pots surrounded the cornucopia and were placed inside white marshmallows. The arena was 3 kilometers in diameter, making it reasonably spacious for the tributes. Inside the cornucopia, as practically every single meter of the arena was filled with food, the only food present was 3 bowls of soup and bottles of water and bread. There were crossbows, tomahawks, tridents, knives, swords, spears, and maces present inside, and as the tributes saw these weapons, they focused on them. Vaton and Azora, both from 1, were on adjacent podiums with Rooker from 12 to the left of Vaton and Mahi from 4 to the right of Azora. Vaton looked weirdly at Azora and cocked his head towards the arena, to which she frowned. As she glanced around, she used rapid sign language to communicate with Vaton. An interpreter said that she was trying to tell him to snap Rooker's neck as soon as the gong sounded, to which he grinned. Zacharias from 10 was in a far left podium with only Jaguar from 6 to his right. As he glanced around at the cornucopia, he set his sights on a set of throwing knives. Larcius from 2 was 2 podiums to his right and grinned sadistically at him, and glancing at Coria from 2, wiggled his little finger towards Zacharias, indicating that he was going to try to kill Zacharias. Vaton and Azora both made eye contact with Zacharias, and Vaton signed to Azora that Zacharias could not even swim. Azora ignored this and nodded at Zacharias before the gong sounded and all 24 of the tributes, with the exception of Duster from 8 and Cedar from 9, ran inwards. Before Rooker had even taken a step off his podium, Vaton tackled him to the ground and they began fighting with their bare hands. Azora ran past the pair and sprinted into the cornucopia. She snatched a tomahawk, but then unfortunately reached for it at the exact same moment as the boy from 9. She gasped for a moment, but then realized the boy had yanked the tomahawk from her hands. He raised the tomahawk, and as he swung it down, he was struck in the back with a knife that had just been thrown by Jaguar. As the boy fell on top of her, Azora noticed Jaguar reaching his arm back to throw another knife. As he threw it, Azora lifted the tomahawk to block it. Jaguar angrily threw another knife, and this time Azora ducked, and the knife instead hit the boy from 11 in the head and he collapsed to the ground. As Azora looked around, she noticed Rooker gaining the upper hand in his fight with Vuitton, and the girls from 10, 8, 6, 5, and 3 forming a pack to hunt down other tributes. As the pack charged towards Jaguar, who was busy throwing a knife at the boy from 3, the 5 girls grabbed him and tackled him to the ground. However, Lisa from 12 ran out of the cornucopia carrying the only available crossbow and shot all of the girls with her arrows in seconds. Meanwhile, Mahi was ramming her trident into the throat of the boy from 7 and left him convulsing on the ground as she joined Finbar from 4, who was locked in combat with the muscular boy from 5. Meanwhile, Vuitton and Rooker continued fighting on the ground. Rooker kicked Vuitton in the face and got up to run, yet Vuitton tackled him by the foot. Rooker fell on top of Vuitton, who was surprised by how hard Rooker was fighting. Rooker punched Vuitton as hard as he could before Vuitton retaliated by kicking him in the groin. Numerous tributes, including Jaguar and Sequoia from 7, ran past the dueling pair, but this did not distract the 2 boys. After being punched several more times by Rooker, Vuitton was bleeding from the nose and was trying to get away. However, Rooker picked him up and threw him to the ground before beginning to strangle him. Vuitton quickly kicked Rooker until he fell to the ground. Rooker got to his feet and fled, which angered Vuitton. He noticed Lisa stealing the crossbow and chased after her as she killed the 5 girls. The boy from 3 crawled past him with a knife in his shoulder, and as he looked up at Vuitton snapped his neck. Vuitton wiped his hands and grinned at the now-dead boy before running after Lisa. Vuitton grabbed her and pushed her to the ground, yet he was suddenly slashed in the leg with a sword that Rooker was now brandishing. As Vuitton groaned in exasperation, Rooker grabbed Lisa and they both fled. As Vaton tried to get to his feet, he noticed his leg wound was hurting, so he lay on the ground. He managed to crawl towards the boy from 5 who had a trident lodged in his arm. As Finbar got ready to plunge a trident into his head, Vaton snapped the boy's neck and began groaning from the pain in his leg. Finbar glanced down at Vaton as Larcius and Coria glanced at each other before roaring and angrily charging at the pair. Vaton tripped Larcius and he fell, which caused Coria to turn in the opposite direction and run. As Larcius gasped at Finbar, who was standing directly above him, Finbar grabbed Larcius' sword and used it to slash his face. Larcius screamed and crawled backwards, whilst Vaton laughed and said, "Not so arrogant now, are you two?" To which Rubius muttered under his breath that at least one District 2 tribute had made it past the Bloodbath this year. As Larcius crawled backwards and begged for mercy, Finbar slashed his face once more and laughed as he let out a high-pitched whimper. Finbar smirked at a sobbing Larcius and Vaton grabbed his sword before plunging it into Larcius' throat. Larcius gasped and began shaking uncontrollably while glaring at Vaton and Finbar. Finbar sadistically laughed, which made Vaton, Azora, and Mahi scowl, as they told him to at least show the two some dignity in death. Finbar sneered at them before walking away. Larcius stopped moving within seconds of being stabbed. 11 cannons sounded, which made the group cheer out. Vaton announced that they barely had any strong opponents left, apart from Coria, Jaguar, Zacharias, and the 12s. As Finbar spoke about how he was going to kill Coria and Zacharias, Azora and Vaton patiently waited for him to finish. When the 4s were distracted, Vaton whispered, "I wonder where the 10 is," to Azora, which made her scowl. She sneered before telling Vaton that she never planned to start an alliance with Zacharias. Vaton laughed before glancing at Finbar, who was being congratulated for his killing of Larcius by Mahi. As the hovercraft retrieved the 11 bodies, the couriers decided to walk towards the nearby cottage where they planned to rest. As they glanced at all the candy, Vaton grabbed a lolly and placed it to his lips. Finbar immediately grabbed it from his hand and licked it, which unfortunately caused his tongue to stick to it. Finbar's allies struggled to contain their laughter as he roared in anger and tried to rip the lolly from his tongue. As Finbar groaned, Vaton eventually decided to grab the sword and he sliced it across the lolly, only for it to get stuck. Vaton swore angrily before grabbing another sword from the cornucopia and slicing off the lolly stick. He held it in his hands before smashing it at Finbar. It hit the lolly, and Vaton continued smashing it until the lolly had come loose. The couriers reached a nearby 2-story hut and entered. The pink door creaked open, and as they walked in, the ice cream lights flickered. Dusty cobwebs covered a yellow cabinet, which made Vaton and Azora frown. Vaton used his sword to slash at the webs and he opened the cabinet, before vomiting on the floor in disgust. As Azora asked him what was wrong, Vaton vomited again and Azora, Finbar, and Mahi glanced through the cabinet, and they all vomited as they saw a box of cereal that was 100 years past its due date. Vaton pushed the cereal out of the way and stabbed his sword into a brown box. As he snatched the sword out of the cabinet, he saw how dusty the box was. Vaton, Azora, Finbar, and Mahi walked toward the round mahogany table and placed the box there, before Finbar grabbed the sword and slashed the box open. To their annoyance, it was only a game called Candyland, which had allegedly been played by young children back in old America and is still enjoyed by children to this day. Vaton shook his head as Finbar told him there was nothing else in the cabinet. After a few minutes of inaction, the 4 couriers decided to inspect and scrutinize the second floor of the house. They found 2 beds in one of the rooms and they all agreed to sleep with their district partners. In the next room, there was a television. Finbar sat on the floor and somehow managed to turn on the Bunger Games, whilst the other 3 surveyed the 2 remaining rooms. As they found an elevator shaft in the corridor, they walked in, and the elevator went down to the underground basement of the hut. As they glanced around at the black, damp room, they decided that Finbar would take the first watch that night. They brought out targets from a crate in the garage and practiced with their weapons before giving each other advice. However, Finbar snapped at Vaton when he told him he needed to throw his arm back further before launching his trident. Vaton glared at him and slowly tightened his grip on his sword, which Finbar noticed. Finbar growled at Vaton, and before their female counterparts could stop them, they were already circling each other with their weapons raised. Azora and Mahi begged Vaton and Finbar not to fight, yet they ignored this and continued circling each other. Vaton began mocking Finbar for being from District 4, telling him that just because his district had produced a career victor the previous year, did not mean that they were automatically part of a career alliance. As Vuitton smirked at Finbar's angry face, he told him that Isla Vale had been saved by a filthy outlier instead of fighting Calyx and winning properly. Finbar's face flushed in anger and he called Vuitton an obscene word, which made him laugh. He told Finbar that Neptune had been killed by an outlier and that the District 4 tributes the previous year had allied themselves with two outlying scum. Finbar told Vuitton to shut up and hold his tongue before shouting, "Cut the cackle!" at him, which made Vuitton laugh even harder. Finbar told him that he was only 16 years old and acting like a fully trained career. Vuitton smirked again and told him that at least he was not an incompetent four who cannot even hold a trident properly. Vuitton raised his sword and threw it, and Finbar braced himself before realizing that Vuitton had been aiming for a target directly above his head. Even Azora laughed with amusement as Vuitton acknowledged Finbar's reaction with a condescending sneer. As Vuitton and Azora laughed, Finbar and Mahi mocked them and snarled before turning their backs to the pair. Vuitton and Azora smirked at each other before taking the elevator upstairs to their assigned bed. The pair seemed happy to share a bed, but as the sun was only starting to set at the moment, they agreed to walk outside for some time. They stealthily climbed out of the window in an attempt to not alert Finbar and Mahi, and leapt onto the ground with thuds. They gave each other a nod and jumped over the gate covering the hut, and they began their stroll. They spoke about their lives back in District 1, and Azora seemed amazed to hear about the elegant Braun nightclub that was near the Carter Bar, where Vuitton spent several hours bowling with his friends on Sunday nights. As Vuitton spoke about the nightclub, Azora spoke about how entrance tickets were allegedly worth a king's ransom. Vuitton raised his eyebrows at her, and Azora laughed, before telling Vuitton that she attended the Richland Academy and that she had seen him around before. They spoke about Vuitton's mischievous friends, Luster and Hero, who had joined the Capital Air Force the previous year, with Vuitton describing them as patriots. After speaking about the cosmopolitan merchant communities and the vast mountainous stretches in District 1, they stopped and began kissing for a bit, both of them clasping the other's faces as they did so. Vuitton asked Azora when she wanted to leave the force, but Azora was suddenly distracted by something in the distance. 3 male figures and 1 female figure could be seen prowling through the lolly trees. Vuitton and Azora noticed the bright glint of one of the swords being carried by one of the more muscular members of the pack. Vuitton frowned and asked Azora if she knew who was part of the pack, but Azora incorrectly guessing the female figure was Koria. As Vuitton nervously gripped his sword, a loud guffaw was heard. Azora glanced at Vuitton in shock, before whispering that the voice belonged to the mechanic of 6. This voice did indeed belong to Jaguar, who was holding a large dagger in his hand. He turned to one of the shadowed figures, and Zacharias stepped forwards with his swords, before shouting at Rooker and Lisa, calling them incompetent and asking them why they could not find the filthy ones. This enraged Vuitton and Azora, and they slowly stepped forward, whilst Jaguar congratulated Zacharias for manipulating the girl so easily. Vuitton grinned at Azora, and Rubius commented, "I told you so," whilst Azora growled in the direction of Jaguar, Zacharias, Rooker, and Lisa. Furious at Zacharias for manipulating her, Azora could be seen smoldering as Zacharias and Jaguar continued laughing. As Zacharias jokingly asked for some wine, Rooker proudly said, "The new alliance between the males from 6 and 10 and the tributes from 12. Ladies and gentlemen, the Hunters!" Vuitton burst into laughter at this pack, but placed his hand over his mouth, which ensured that none of the pack could hear him. Vuitton looked at Azora and they immediately turned around, before beginning to run. After reaching for a few minutes, they began walking back to their camp. After around 20 minutes of walking, it became dark and they reached the camp. Finbar and Mahi were upset with the pair sneaking out and were waiting for them at the door. Finbar grabbed some bread from his bag and split it into chunks before sharing it with Mahi. Realizing Finbar had no intention to share any food with them, Vuitton climbed above the roof and yanked some candy off the chimney. He shared it with Azora, and she grinned, telling Vuitton that this was in fact several cakes stacked on top of each other. Vuitton and Azora ate the cake, to the annoyance of Finbar and Mahi. The pack split up to sleep, and Vuitton and Azora stayed awake in their shared bed for about an hour, before becoming intimate with their shirts off. After kissing for a long time, Rubius yawned, but just then Horn of Plenty played and the portraits of Larcius from 2, the boy and girl from 3, the boy and girl from 5, the girl from 6, the boy from 7, the girl from 8, the boy from 9, the girl from 10, and the boy from 11 were shown, which left just 13 tributes remaining. The pair from District 1 continued kissing till dawn, before they both fell asleep. Before doing so, however, Vuitton confessed that his girlfriend had broken up with him the previous year before being killed in the 102nd Hunger Games. Azora shook her head and told Vuitton that no one's life was that terrible, but Vuitton smiled and said that he had cheered out when his ex-girlfriend, Hart Bates, had been killed in the bloodbath. As Azora asked him why he was so happy that Hart had died, Vuitton said she had brought shame to her family and the district now looked down on her, which was fitting revenge as she had dumped him extremely coldly. After he was done, Azora laughed, before telling Vuitton that she had ended her relationship with Giorgio Jones just 2 months before they both volunteered. Vuitton laughed and asked her if she had actually dated Giorgio, which made Azora grin. She said she no longer cared for him as he was extremely conceited, due to him being the great-great-grandson of a former victor and a cousin of Petro and Cayenne Jones, whom he believed would have won had it not been for the softies, referring to Estelle Van Roosh and Mirai, although he made sure not to mention Mirai, so as to not enrage his mentors. After discussing Giorgio and Hart for some more time, the pair slept, but soon woke up in the early hours of the second day in order to go for a stroll down to the cornucopia. Again, they snuck out of the window and Vuitton leapt to the ground first, gracefully catching Azora in his arms. They held hands as they walked towards the cornucopia, which was around 800 meters away from their location. As they happily walked through the candy pots, Vuitton noticed a small bird perched on a lolly. They ignored this and instead continued walking until the cornucopia came into view. They ran towards it and after a few minutes they reached it. As Azora gazed in admiration at one of the tomahawks, Vuitton noticed another bird. Azora noted that this was a jabberjay, yet just then a knife flew to the left of one of her feet. Azora gasped as Jaguar ran out from behind the cornucopia and threw another knife at her. Vuitton lunged at Jaguar, which knocked both of them to the ground. As Vuitton shouted for Azora to run, Rooker ran out from behind and tackled her to the ground. Vuitton reached for his sword, but his eyes widened in shock as he remembered that he had left his sword in the career camp. Vuitton kicked Jaguar in the mouth and ran into the cornucopia and grabbed the nearest weapon, which, to his pleasure, was a kukri sword. Vuitton noticed Jaguar running towards him and sliced the sword through the air, which caused Jaguar to jump back. As he grabbed the knife to throw it at Vuitton, Vuitton threw the sword, which caused the knife to fly out of Jaguar's hand. Realizing Vuitton would be able to kill Jaguar if he did not have a weapon, Zacharias threw his sword towards Jaguar's hand. Realizing Zacharias was on the roof of the cornucopia, Azora slammed her leg into one of Rooker's private parts, with this kick having to be censored. He let out a shrill wail and fell to the ground, clutching himself in agony. Vuitton nodded at Azora as Jaguar charged at him with the sword and the two of them began a scrappy sword fight. The birds began chirping and the pack laughed, muttering "jabberjays" under their breaths. Vuitton glanced at a crying Rooker, yet just then Lisa charged inside carrying a cornucopia. As she ran towards Azora, Azora did not notice and raised a tomahawk to kill Rooker, yet Lisa fired an arrow at her arm. Azora screamed in pain and dropped the tomahawk onto the ground. Vuitton grabbed the tomahawk and sliced it at Azora, who jumped back. Vuitton finally managed to slice Jaguar with his sword before Jaguar grabbed his sword and sliced Vuitton's foot, where he had been wounded by Rooker the previous morning. Vuitton yelped in pain as the wound reopened and he dropped to the ground impaled whilst fighting over the sword with Jaguar, who was bleeding from the wound in his thigh, which had been sliced by Vuitton. The boys fought over the sword whilst Azora groaned from the pain in her arm and turned around to see Lisa aiming another arrow at her. Vuitton noticed this and, holding his leg in pain, hobbled over to Azora, who was glaring at Lisa. Vuitton crawled towards them with his sword and just as he was about to slash Lisa's leg, he glanced down and fired an arrow at him. However, Azora chose this moment to jump on top of Lisa and tackled her to the ground. Rooker grabbed a lolly tree and ran towards Azora, whilst Rubius and Priscilla asked how he expected to kill someone with a lolly tree. Vuitton saw him approaching and kicked him in the face, which hurt his foot and caused him to moan. As Rooker fell to the ground, Vuitton slashed his sword at Lisa, who scampered backwards. Vuitton did not give up and shouted at Azora to kill Rooker, who had just gotten to his feet. Vuitton tackled Lisa to the ground and they fought on the ground for a few moments. As Rubius and Priscilla announced that this conflict had taken place only 5 hours since dawn and it was still dark in the sky, Vuitton punched Lisa in the face. As her nose began bleeding and she gasped out in pain, Vuitton angrily smashed her face into the ground, but even this did not kill her. As Azora charged at Rooker with her tomahawk, Jaguar and Zacharias charged towards the District 1 tributes and threw them onto the ground. Azora kicked Zacharias repeatedly in the groin before slapping him in the cheek with an open palm, which caused him to gasp. Vuitton took a deep breath and sliced his sword at Jaguar's wound, which caused him to cry out. Ignoring Jaguar, Vuitton ran towards Zacharias and tackled him to the ground before smashing his sword against his neck. Zacharias slowly got to his feet and raised out a hand towards Jaguar, presumably for help. Yet just then, Vuitton and Azora both brought their respective weapons into the front of his neck simultaneously, which caused Zacharias' head to roll off and sounded his cannon. Priscilla frowned in disgust at Zacharias' body, with his hand still stretched out. For a few moments, his hand remained in the air, but then his body gave in and pitched forward. As Vuitton brandished his sword at Jaguar, Azora used her tomahawk to slice Lisa's bow in half. She glanced at the pair from 12, and as Vuitton joined her, Jaguar fled. As Vuitton groaned, Brooker kicked him in the stomach and turned to run, whilst he and Azora both threw their weapons at him, both of which narrowly missed. Lisa took her chance and ran in the opposite direction, whilst Vuitton sighed out in exhaustion and grabbed some soup from the cornucopia. He grinned at Azora, and they both walked back to the camp, although at an extremely slow pace. After 10 minutes, they reached the camp, and due to it still being dark, they went to sleep whilst waiting for Finbar and Mahi to wake. Due to the exhausting fight, they slept through most of the morning and were only awoken when it was midday. Finbar and Mahi were eating some bread and soup when Vuitton and Azora walked downstairs. Finbar told them that they had found the soup in their room just before midday and were making a meal out of it. As Finbar and Mahi offered some soup to Vuitton and Azora, they gladly agreed and slurped it. After they were done, Finbar asked if they knew who had died that morning, as they had awoken a few minutes after a cannon went off. Realizing this, Vuitton shrugged and told Finbar and Mahi that the demented cow of 10 had snuck into the hut that morning and that Vuitton and Azora had beheaded him. As Finbar looked at them with a funny expression, he asked why there was no blood on the ground. Vuitton told him that they had killed Zacharias and had then thrown him out the window for the hovercraft to collect his body. This was supported by the blood in their room, which had been caused by the wounds they had sustained during their fight with the hunters. Vuitton and Azora informed Finbar and Mahi of this pact, which made Finbar spit in disgust and ask who the outliers thought they were to be forming an alliance to attack the couriers. As Mahi noticed Vuitton's foot wound, she asked what had happened. He glanced nervously at Azora before telling Mahi that he had injured it during the bloodbath. Mahi sighed and told Vuitton he should have covered the wound with a bandage. As she got one from her bag, she noticed that Azora was bleeding from her arm. Mahi paused for a second before telling Azora that she had not seen that wound after the bloodbath. Finbar glanced at them as Azora stated that Zacharias had shot an arrow at her. Mahi frowned, saying that she thought Lisa had stolen the only crossbow from the cornucopia. Azora reminded her that Lisa was allies with Zacharias, but Mahi suddenly pointed at Azora and asked why none of the other hunters had been with Zacharias. Finbar smacked his lips whilst Vuitton slowly snuck up behind him without him noticing. Mahi asked Azora why the other hunters had not attacked her, and then he marched upstairs before marching back down about 30 seconds later and asking Azora where she had gotten an extra sword and a tomahawk from. Azora walked upstairs, saying she had to use the bathroom, but instead went to the Four's room and stole a knife. She walked back down, hiding the knife behind her back. Vuitton crept closer to a laughing Finbar, whilst Mahi marched towards Azora and slapped her. As Azora gasped in pain, Mahi slapped her again and asked her what she was hiding. As Azora frowned, she tightened her grip on her knife as Mahi asked her what had happened this morning. Azora took a deep breath before reaching her arm back and throwing her knife at Mahi's neck. Just then, Vuitton reached Finbar and snapped his neck while he was still looking in awe at the conflict between Azora and Mahi. His cannon sounded and Vuitton let him fall to the ground before joining Azora, who was towering over a whimpering Mahi, who had the knife lodged in her throat. She placed her fingers around her neck and she began shaking. Vuitton and Azora laughed as Mahi continued whimpering. Dollar was invited into the commentary box and he stated that this was fitting revenge for Isla Vale having killed Calix the previous year. but just then a scuffle burst out in the metro section of Snow Square as Limerick and Isla attacked Mirai for the treachery of Vuitton and Azora. Mahi continued shaking for a few moments until her cannon finally sounded and Vuitton and Azora collapsed to the ground in exhaustion. The ringing of a sponsor gift alerted them and they glanced as a parachute came flying through the window. As they examined the note, they read it aloud and viewers could hear that it read, "Good job with the 4s and the 10 from D&M. Vuitton and Azora grinned as they unwrapped the present and saw a collection of luxury items. As they held chocolate bars in their hands, Azora grinned at the wine before saying that they would drink it tonight to celebrate victory. Vuitton smiled at her before taking out some rare roast chicken from the box and grabbing the cutlery. As he and Azora shared some of the chicken and finished the meal of Finbar and Mahi, they agreed to have one more intimacy session tonight. After eating, they decided to go for another walk, but they began noticing Jabberjays. After stabbing some with the knife she had stolen from the force, Azora told Vuitton that they might need to move back. Just then, a type of hallucinogenic smoke covered the pair as well as the clearing they were walking through. More Jabberjays flew in, and as Azora shouted for Vuitton, barking could be heard. Vuitton shouted that these were mutts and they needed to run, but through the vision cameras, Azora's eyes could be seen to widen in shock. She shouted out Cherish's name, yet just then 2 more barks came from her left. She shouted for Blessing, before crying out for Cherish again. She called out the names of both her dogs for the next 2 minutes as Vuitton glanced at her and asked her why she had named the mutts. Azora shouted at Vuitton to shut up, but just then a young woman could be heard screaming and Vuitton's eyes widened in fear. He shouted for Selenita and began running towards the tree before colliding with it and falling to the ground. He continued shouting his twin sister's name, but as he began to realize that this was not Selenita, his father and mother's voices began screaming. As he collided with a tree again, he swore and shouted that these were not real. He grabbed his sword and randomly swiped in the air before striking a Jabberjay. As it fell to the ground, he sliced another one in half. Just then, Azora's brothers, Lux, Royal, and Jupiter, could be heard screaming for her help. She shouted for them, but then bumped into a Jabberjay and they both collapsed to the ground. The screams of Lux, Royal, and Jupiter slowly ended as the pair looked at each other in confusion. As this was happening, the fox still roamed the clearing and they heard more screams as Rooker shouted for his mother. Rooker had spent the morning roaming around the arena and had noticed the pair a few minutes prior, but as he was getting closer, the fog covered him and he heard his mother screaming. Vuitton licked his lips and walked towards the screams, but just then Rooker charged at him. Thankfully, he ran straight past Vuitton and out of the clearing, but he was unable to see and charged into a clearing about 30 meters away with his eyes squeezed shut. This amused Vuitton, but he quickly grabbed Azora and they turned to run. A cannon went off seconds after they left the clearing, which was revealed to viewers to belong to Sequoia, after Rooker had run into her camp and had bludgeoned her to death with a lolly tree. As Sequoia's bloodied body was taken away by the hovercraft, Vuitton groaned, before telling Azora he would never underestimate a District 12 tribute again, as he correctly guessed that Rooker had killed Sequoia. The hours passed and the pair walked back to their hut. Another cannon went off as the sun set, which was revealed to viewers to belong to Lisa, after she had encountered Coria and had been stabbed, leading to a rather agonizing death as she attempted to move away from a smoking Coria. The pair walked back into their camp and used the remaining chicken to eat some dinner. As they finished eating some more bread, they walked into their room while squealing in excitement. Vuitton and Azora spoke about how different the house was without Finbar and Mahi. Whilst they had previously only taken off their tops, they took off their shirts as well and got into the bed in excitement. After about 2 hours of intimacy, midnight came around and reported to Sequoia from 7, Zacharias from 10, and Lisa from 12 were shown, which left just 8 tributes remaining. These 8 were Vuitton and Azora, both from 1, Coria from 2, Jaguar from 6, Duster from 8, Cedar from 9, Summer from 11, and Rooker from 12. The next morning, Vuitton and Azora awoke early and kissed each other for a few moments before smirking at each other and jumping out of bed. They opened the windows and as they walked downstairs to eat, they noticed that they had eaten all their food. As they glanced up in annoyance, a sponsor gift could be heard ringing. As they walked outside, they saw the gift contained some body armor and some baked ham and cheese buns. As they grinned and began to eat, they looked up to see a large dog glaring at them. As Vuitton nervously glanced at Azora, another dog crept towards them. An announcement from game maker friend told the tributes that these dog moths are extremely vicious and that good night. As Vuitton and Azora looked at each other, the dogs bared their teeth and began running. They glanced at each other just as a wave of darkness covered them. They sprinted towards the cornucopia in opposite directions, with Vuitton crashing through the trees and Azora leaping from rooftop to rooftop in the dark. Azora fell to the ground after misjudging one of her jumps, and she gasped as she hit her arm hard on the ground. Vuitton heard her cry of pain but ignored this, instead continuing to run and muttering, "My victory," under his breath. After a few minutes, despite the darkness, Vuitton sprinted extremely fast and made it into the cornucopia clearing and the barking stopped. He noticed the bright morning sunlight and smiled, before walking into the cornucopia and holding his sword at the ready. Meanwhile, Azora was now crying out from the pain in her arm, and Rubius suggested that she must have sprained it. Priscilla agreed whilst Azora whimpered and a dog could be heard coming closer to her. As she squealed, her hands found a lolly tree and she used her legs and her uninjured arm to pull herself up. As she finished climbing up, she jumped to another tree, despite not knowing where it was. She reached it and, using her instincts, continued jumping from tree to tree. As she was about 50 meters from the cornucopia, she dropped to the ground on her injured arm and screamed for her brothers. Meanwhile, in Snow Square, Priscilla had organized an interview with the families of the 8 remaining tributes. Through reporters in District 1, Vuitton's parents and twins and sister Selenita, as well as Azora's parents and brothers, were speaking about their children in glowing terms as they had now reached what was sure to be the final day. Lux appeared uneasy, before saying that he knew Azora could get back up. Azora scoffed and placed her tomahawk between her teeth, and whilst it appeared to be heavy, Azora did not seem to care and she continued running. After about 10 minutes of running, she reached the cornucopia and noticed that no one was there, apart from Vuitton, who was walking out of the cornucopia. Vuitton gave Azora a sorry smile before saying that there was a chance the final fight would not be between them. As Azora frowned and raised her eyebrows at Vuitton, he placed his sword on the ground and Azora suspiciously did the same with her tomahawk. As Vuitton grinned at her, he said the last 2 days with her had been especially fun for him. He told her that he had just as much fun with her the last week as he had when volunteering at the Braun nightclub. Azora chuckled under her breath, before looking sadly at Vuitton and telling him that only one could win. As Vuitton told her that he knew, she said that the other tributes would be arriving soon. As they sat and waited, a cannon went off, which belonged to Cedar, after she had encountered Coria and had been thrown towards the mutations. As Vuitton and Azora glanced at each other in a rather melancholic way, Coria burst in through the cornucopia and ran straight past them. She collapsed on the ground, and as she caught her breath, Rubius and Priscilla noticed that her face was purple as she had run an extremely fast distance to the cornucopia. As she continued gasping for breath, she glared at Vuitton and Azora and approached them with a sword so small it looked like a dagger. However, just then the moths ran through the clearing and all 3 of them swore, before beginning to climb up the roof of the structure. As they reached the roof, Azora winced from the amount of pressure in her arm and Vuitton glared at Coria before calling her an obscene word. She laughed as she crossed over to them, but Duster then ran inwards whilst being chased by the moths, and without even noticing Vuitton, Azora, or Coria, he climbed to the top of the roof, but realizing his 3 strongest opponents were there, he slowly lowered himself. The moths barked at him, yet he ran inwards and climbed up onto the wall, with the muscles in his arms rippling as he held himself up from the barking moths. He swore loudly at all of them, whilst Vuitton, Azora, and Coria looked at each other in puzzlement, presumably due to the absence of Jaguar, Summer, and Rooker. Vuitton and Azora glanced at a now guffawing Coria, who was taunting them and making rather rude remarks towards them. Despite not even having harmed them, she raised her muscular arms in triumph and spoke about how she had been built to win, before going into details about the 5 hours of weightlifting practice she went to every day. Voicing her anger about Larcius's death, Coria did not notice Jaguar running inward and throwing his knife at her. The knife hit her shoulder and she collapsed onto the roof at Vuitton's feet. He smirked at her and said, "Weightlifting, huh?" and jamming his sword into her back. She screamed in pain and somehow managed to get up, which angered Vuitton. As she stepped towards him with great difficulty, he stabbed her again with his sword, which finally killed her. Her cannon sounded and Jaguar glanced at Duster before brandishing his 3 remaining knives at the moths. Rooker ran in from the other side and threw a tomahawk at Jaguar, which missed him and instead killed a mutt. Jaguar laughed and charged at Rooker, but just then Summer ran in with a spear and threw it as hard as she could towards the now dueling pair. The spear impaled Rooker's abdomen and he dropped to the ground with a roar of pain. He twitched on the ground as Summer walked past him and retrieved her spear, smiling sadly at him before saying that she was sorry, but that she really wanted to return back to District 1. Rooker appeared to be in too much pain to notice what she was saying, but he gave her a brief smile before his cannon sounded. Duster finally swore and jumped to the ground to face Jaguar and Summer, who were holding their weapons at the ready. Duster glanced at both of them before running towards Jaguar instead, armed with a knife. He got ready to throw the knife at him, but Jaguar knocked it out of his hands with his muscular arms. Vuitton and Dozora watched as Jaguar stabbed Duster in the head and pushed him to the ground, before glancing at Summer. He snarled at her and licked his lips, saying that a boy from District 6 had not won since the 61st games, and he charged at Summer. He tackled her to the ground and they began fighting, before Summer speared Jaguar in the leg and he stabbed her in the throat. She lay on the ground and glared at Jaguar, before shutting her eyes. Her cannon sounded, and as Jaguar looked up to see the District 1 tributes, Ozora slipped off the cornucopia structure as Duster's cannon sounded. Jaguar grinned and strutted towards Ozora, but as he raised his knife to stab her, Vuitton jumped from the cornucopia and landed on his back. Jaguar called Vuitton an obscene name as Vuitton pinned him to the ground. As they began fighting, Vuitton stabbed Jaguar in the leg, before pummeling his head so hard into the ground his skull could be heard cracking and his cannon immediately sounded. Vuitton turned to Ozora and smiled at her, before tightening his grip on his sword. Ozora did the same with her tomahawk and told Vuitton her time in the arena with him had been fun, but as they were careers, this fun would have to come to an end. Vuitton grinned at her and told her he understood, before raising his sword into the air and charging at her. Ozora shouted out as she raised her tomahawk in defense and narrowly blocked Vuitton's sword from hitting her face. The pair began dueling, and as they were both very skilled in combat, it was hard for them to strike each other with their weapons. Ozora was walking backwards as she blocked Vuitton's numerous attacks as she swore in fear. She raised her arm as if to throw the tomahawk and Vuitton jumped back. Ozora did not throw it, but Vuitton was now distracted and he roared in anger. Before he could attack her again, however, Ozora slammed a tomahawk into his heart, which spun him away from the cornucopia. Vuitton cried out and placed a hand on his scarlet shirt, which was now soaked in blood. As Ozora whispered "sorry" to him, he nodded and placed his other hand above his heart. He said he understood and his cannon sounded. Azora Asimov of District 1 was announced to be the victor of the 103rd Hunger Games, and Azora cried out tears of relief and happiness. She held her hands high in pride and smiled before entering the hovercraft that had arrived. For her victor's interview, Azora wore a scarlet dress that was covered in all sorts of gemstones. Her curly hair flew behind her and her green eyes pierced the cameras as she entered the stage. She spoke about her time with Vuitton in glowing terms, saying he had been a good ally and a worthy career tribute. She congratulated Jaguar, Zacharias, Rooker, and Lisa for forming their own alliance, although she said it was unlikely there would ever be such an alliance like this ever again. She ended her interview by offering her thanks to Mirai Kobayashi and Dollar Crusoe, saying that almost all 23 of her opponents had been valiant and worthy competitors this year. After her victory, Azora stayed in the capital for a few months. However, she soon returned to District 1, where, to her surprise, Vuitton's family did not blame her for his death, stating that he would have wanted for her to win anyways. She worked at the training academy, teaching reconnaissance to her tributes and was known as a worthy teacher. She moved into Victor's village and from there, she operated several jewelry stores she owned, naming one Vuitton, in memory of her fallen ally. Okay, so thank you for watching these videos. I would like to make an announcement. My name is Dustin Al-Fayed, and at the end of the next episode, I will be doing a Q&A. I have pinned a comment down below, and please, if you have any questions for me, you can reply into the comment. I also have a slightly sad confession to make because starting from Monday, my laptop will be confiscated in school because I was caught checking comments in YouTube during class. It's not that long, only 2 weeks, but that means I will slightly have to postpone the posting of the 104th Hunger Games to maybe sometime in December. I am so sorry, but I promise 104 will be just as good as everything else I've written. And remember, I'm doing the Q&A. Thank you so much, and bye.